It's a great pleasure and privilege to introduce Hito and Evgeny. And as Steffi said, as part of the art sessions, we very often invite artists to also suggest with whom they want to be in conversation with. And Hito immediately suggested to actually be joined here by Evgeny, and particularly to discuss a new amazing text which Evgeny has written called The Digital Intermediation of Everything at the Intersection of Politics, Technology, and Finance. As Steffi already said, Hito is a video artist, filmmaker, theorist, author, and journalist, has just written an amazing book which came out a few weeks ago, Duty-Free Art, Art in the Age of Planetary Civil War. And we've been actually doing a whole series of interviews in lots of different contexts, working towards a project at the Serpentine Galleries in London involving technologists, involving artists, researchers. So I'm very delighted that today our seventh conversation is happening here at DLD. Evgeny needs no introduction because he's been to DLD, of course, before. His books include The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, and also To Save Everything, click here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Hito and Evgeny. And maybe we can start with a few questions to Hito. Hito, your current research for the projects I mentioned have to do with predicting the future and who or what has agency to do so. In this research, you've observed that in the process of seeking truth or insight from machine intelligence, we are willingly ignoring more accurate predictions from humans about their environment. So I was wondering if you could tell us here a little bit more about this research and how it will manifest itself in the artworks you will realize.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Hans-Ulrich, and also Evgeny. I'm working on a new project at the moment which is called Power, and it is about power. I was asking myself, prediction is a very important question now in technology. Prediction of the future, prediction based on big data, machine learning, and so on. But what about human predictors? This is the real question, because there's a lot of humans who are actually very good at predicting because they live in the circumstances they have to deal with. So how about harnessing technology to listen to these people? And I will give you one concrete example I was very moved by. It's from London, actually from North Kensington, where the Serpentine Gallery is, which is one of the most unequal areas in the whole of Europe. There was a massive fire in a tower block, recently called Grenfell Tower, and actually people that lived there predicted very well that some kind of catastrophe was going to happen. The reason was they noticed tremendous power surges in the building, meaning inequalities in voltage, and it led to their computer monitors exploding. But basically the problem was not fixed. So my question is, why did no one listen to those human predictors who gave a 100% accurate prediction about what was going to happen? And how could one harness technology to sort of support this kind of predictions? And of course, the topic of power is interesting because it has to do with energy. It also has to do with political power, economical power, but also if you think about power surges or inequality in power, then I guess this could be a very potent metaphor also for the deregulation, defunding, and structural underdevelopment of infrastructure, which we are seeing right now.
And also we've been discussing a lot lately Yuval Harari's book, and Ben Vickers also drew my attention to a talk actually Harari gave at Google called The Techno-Religions and Silicon Prophets. In this talk, he laid out the history of the great religions of our time: Christianity, Islam, liberalism, socialism, and so on. So with the advent of AI, and in particular, of course, the black box neural nets, he suggests that we are seeing a return to a form of scripture and oracles for the decisions we make in the world. So it's a new form of decision making. And I'm curious to have your take on this idea, and also whether you think that Harari's analysis is actually correct.
Well, I don't know whether it's correct or not, but I noticed that as well, that the topic not only of divination of the oracle, but also of, deities or God or different kinds of God is making a very strange kind of re-entry into the discourse with machine learning. So the more, let's say, technologically advanced the discussion is, the more it also goes into a spiritual direction, apparently. I noticed that especially within younger engineer circles, and as a response I wrote a text myself about a spiritual question, in my view, which tries to apply one of the most pointed religious questions to the field of machine learning, which is the question, how many angels fit on the on the tip of a needle? And if you translate this to the age of machine learning, then of course you end up with some questions. How many AIs fit onto the tip of a needle? And in theology, the question was phrased even more succinctly. They would perform a dance on the tip of the needle. So I was asking myself, what kind of dance do these AIs perform on the tip of a needle? And of course, this question has been solved already in relation to angels. There was a scientist that calculated that actually 10 to the power of minus 49 angels would fit on the top of a needle. He calculated that using quantum gravity and whatnot. He also said that the tip of the needle might collapse into a black hole if they wouldn't dance fast enough. But the most interesting thing is this doesn't solve the main question, which is, what kind of dance are these AIs going to perform, right? I mean, who is the choreographer? Who is going to coordinate all these entities, which in the age of machine learning are, of course, not angels, but humans and things and infrastructure, powers, political powers, institutions, and so on and so on. So who is choreographing their interaction? Who is orchestrating that dance? And I think this decision, which is also an aesthetic decision, cannot be automated, right? This has to remain somehow in the realm of human decision, also of aesthetic decision. This is the one thing you cannot basically leave to machines. And in the course of writing this text, I also noticed something else, which is an interesting question relating to angels and art history. Namely, in art history, it turns out that angels have no shadow, right? Because apparently they are made of light and they radiate light, so they have no shadow. But in the case of AI or machine learning, I think it's actually the opposite. I think we don't even really know yet what those entities are going to be, because they are in the course of being developed, yet the shadow is already visible. The shadow of machine learning, the social cost of automation, the social cost of what I call artificial stupidity. All these things are already very visible in the social field. So paying more attention to the shadow of artificial intelligence is something I would suggest.
Yeah, and that's what you actually, in our marathon, we always have at the Serpentine a marathon every year where we bring together 50 speakers from all disciplines to address an urgent topic for the 21st century, deeply believing in this idea that we can only find solutions if we really pool all the forms of knowledge and go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. And this year the theme was, actually last year, 2017, the theme was the ghost, the host, the machine. It was about artificial intelligence, about machine learning. And you presented a very amazing talk there, which has to do with bubble vision, which is a term you use for immersive technologies like VR with 360-degree vision. And you pointed out there that even if the viewer is in the center of the sphere, yet somehow the viewer is missing from the scene. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit here, maybe a summary of this bubble vision. There are, of course, also many links to the famous discussion on the filter bubble. And we can even link it from the bubble to the sphere, to the recently so famous Da Vinci, non-Da Vinci painting.
Yes,
Maybe you have to move your mic a bit
Okay.
Even I can't hear you.
Okay.
A bit closer.
Let's try.
It's very
Okay.
quiet.
Or maybe we need a portable microphone, a handheld microphone. I don't know.
So my background is cinematography.
Yeah.
I'm actually trained as a camera person. So for me, the transition into 360-degree media, into immersive environments is very fascinating. But I've noticed that in VR, but also in 360-degree video, there is a kind of paradoxical situation happening. You, as a viewer and as a user, are in the middle of the scene, but usually you are not there. You don't have a body, you don't have a feet, you don't. Sometimes you have hands, but that's the best technology can do. So what does it mean to be at the center of a technology, yet missing from it? So I tried to trace this phenomena through, a lot of different cultural artifacts, and I think actually that the famous painting Salvator Mundi, which was auctioned at $450 million recently to go to the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, is a very interesting example because, not only does it point at a bubble market in art, which has a lot of different reasons and which has been going on more or less since the beginning of the century, but also the thing that most people don't really notice is that he's holding this optical device in his hand, which is an orb made of rock crystal, a transparent orb, and this is the world for him. And actually, these orbs are very important devices also in virtual reality. For example, if you want to teleport somewhere in virtual reality, you click on orbs. Visual spheres in virtual reality are organized as sort of photo orbs. So basically, these bubble spheres are one of the main characteristics in VR. We could see that recently when Mark Zuckerberg was demoing on Facebook Live, his new VR social space, he used these transport orbs to teleport himself into spaces like Puerto Rico, where, recently a hurricane had devastated the whole scenery. So basically, what I'm trying to do in going through bubble vision is to connect all these different spheres. The sphere of climate change, the sphere of trying to represent the world, the sphere of new optical technologies which are shaped, through these rounded lenses and photo orbs.
Maybe we all should use this, it's maybe better. The question, of course, of the bubble and what you've just been describing leads us also to another big question, the Anthropocene. And man is meant to be in the center of nature in the same way as in the bubble vision. And the question, of course, then is if in fact he or she is missing from both. Is it the end of the Anthropocene already? You made the comment that the minute humans realize they are at the center of the universe, they begin handing over power to automated procedures. So I was wondering if you think that this is actually the direction we are heading.
So there's a very interesting link to the notion of Anthropocene, which is the so-called Obrist theory. Orbis meaning the sphere. Orbis theory was developed by two climate scientists who figure out that there is a dip in carbon dioxide, a significant one in 1610. So what happened in 1610? Why would the climate change? This may also have been the start of what was called the Little Ice Age in Europe. And they thought that the reason was quite simple. It was the consequence of the colonization of the Americas, which, according to them, killed off around 50 million people. And then the vegetation grew back in the deserted landscapes, which means that, a lot of carbon dioxide was being sequestered and captured, which led to this dip and also to the change in climate. So that they suggest to name this period the beginning of the area in which humans significantly shape their environment. And so at this point in time, you have this paradox. On the one hand, human or man is at the center of their environment and supposedly in charge of everything. But on the other hand, you have these 50 million people who are missing. They are no longer there. And I think it's this paradox which is also expressed in bubble vision. People are at the center, and at the same time they are not there. It's somehow as if unconsciously, this situation is being repeated in this visual paradigm.
It kind of almost leads to our very first interview in 2006. We talked about Roland Barthes' kind of vision of Tokyo and the kind of empty center. Anyway, I wanted to make the transition to Evgeny, and also maybe before we ask Evgeny about his manifesto, and he's fascinating because we live in a time where there are not many manifestos, and this text clearly is one. I wanted to ask you, Hito, what fascinated you about this text and why you wanted to talk here with Evgeny?
I think it's a very important text which, assembles many of the topics you're dealing with for a long time, like digital extraction, for example. But also it gives some very concrete recommendations, and I was mostly interested in these. Maybe you could summarize a little, first of all, what the text is about and what it's not doing. You emphasize this very strongly at the beginning, but then also what are the kind of recommendations for the digital age you come up with at the end?
Sure. Well, I know that people in the art world tend to view every essay as a manifesto, but this was not written as a manifesto, even though it does have more of kind of policy substance as to what needs to be done than my usual ramblings. That said, let me, again, given that they picked this text, not me, and none of you have read it because it appeared in a very obscure publication, let me at least give you some hints broadly where I think we stand vis-a-vis digital technology and big digital platforms which are responsible for those technologies, why it's problematic for some but not for others, and what some of the solutions to this challenge might be. I think the first most important question to ask and answer is, who are these technologies good and bad for? Clearly, if most of you in this room are in venture capital, then it's not really problematic by any stretch of imagination. Things are going well, and there is plenty of things to invest in, and I don't think that any of you wake up deeply alarmed in the morning. That said, I think we have not really thought through the consequences of this for many of the people who are not privileged to be part of the venture capital circuit, so to say. And this is where, whenever we reflect upon this digital sphere and this handful of firms, previously it was, of course, mostly American firms. There were 4 or 5 American giants. All of you know them, and they've added something like probably $700 or $800 billion to their market capitalization just last year alone. Now we also have 3 or 4 big Chinese ones, right? So there is this battle going on between them, and I think there are quite a few people who think that that battle, for better or worse, is going to produce quite a lot of benefits to ordinary users. And the argument that I think is usually invoked in this context is that ultimately they're driving down the costs of many services, they're offering many services for free, they are filling in the gaps that are left by the state when it comes to the provision of many previously critical and essential services, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's transportation. So there is an assumption that somehow by digitizing everything and by collecting data about everything, we would be able to create some kind of a parallel, if you will, maybe heavily digitized and heavily privatized welfare state that might actually be of quite some benefit to ordinary users. And that is what I would describe as the logic of compassion. That is, to some extent, driving many of these technology firms. It's a very pragmatic decision on their behalf. I mean, they're more than happy to either offer us free services in exchange for the data that we generate, which previously was fed just into the advertising systems, but is increasingly fed into their deep learning systems, and thus allows them to generate one of the more advanced forms of artificial intelligence that is now also entering every service of theirs. And secondly, they're interested genuinely in our well-being to some extent, in as much as they need to still be selling advertising, or in the case of Amazon, to be selling goods. So an economy where everybody is impoverished and has no income whatsoever is not an economy where there is a lot of advertising or anybody is buying or selling goods, which explains why so many of these firms are so keen on advocating, for example, for basic income. Right? They do not want to be the ones necessarily paying for it, preferring to invest in things like space tourism, because every oligarch needs a safe escape route. But nonetheless, they do have this interest. Right? That ultimately, if you do provide some kind of a safety valve and you provide some kind of safety net, people will continue consuming forever. But in addition to this logic of compassion, which some of us recognize as unambiguously good and beneficial, there is also what I would call the logic of indifference. And that logic of indifference comes from a very simple fact that ultimately there is a limit as to how much data that we can produce they actually need. It's not, in this sense, data is not like oil. You do need oil to permanently drive the economy because the economy needs some kind of an energy input. Right? In the case of data, and as much as we think about data powering better advertising or data powering better artificial intelligence, there is a limit as to how much goods, so to say, we ourselves possess and can give them. At some point, there comes a saturation point where ultimately these firms have everything they need from us, and they can more or less shift from offering consumer services, revolving around advertising or YouTube, and you name it, to more or less services that will be all underwritten and underpinned by artificial intelligence and will be pitched to businesses or will be pitched to governments. Right? And I think here we already see a lot of this with these firms pitching services related to cyber insurance or cyber security. Google now even offers deep learning as a service to the industry, right? So having accumulated all this data from us, partly, they can now actually start pitching their services elsewhere. So the consumer and the user itself becomes kind of dispensable. Right? And the fear that I think is not a fear that we should trivialize is that this kind of logic of benevolence that we have taken for granted and this logic of compassion might actually have an expiry date. And after that date, we become the online surplus population of some kind. Right? Where, of course, it's not that they will not be targeting us with some offers, but the kind of web and the kind of digital economy that we took for granted, where everything was free and heavily subsidized by those firms or by venture capitalists, it will more or less go away. And once you start fully pricing the cost of all those services, once you start actually charging people for the actual cost of using YouTube, using AI, using all the rest of it, you will quickly realize that our economy, as it functions right now, cannot actually continue. Because most people just wouldn't have the money to pay for these things that are currently heavily subsidized. So that's kind of the overall economic background that I think is very important to keep in mind, that this data extractivism phase, which has started 5 or 7 years ago, as these companies realize that you really need a lot of data to improve your artificial intelligence services, that era will come to an end, at which point it's not obvious to me who actually needs from those companies us, the users. Now, there are many other dimensions to the problem, and we don't really have time to go into all of them. There is some kind of intellectual hegemony that I think that exists in terms of how we even perceive the world now, under the influence of many of those companies. There are many other consequences. To me, if I were in business and if I were not in venture capital, I would be very worried about the fact that access to one of the most important resources of this new era, namely machine learning, and in this case deep learning and artificial intelligence, is heavily concentrated in the hands of just one industry. Which means that everybody else who, for competitive purposes, would need to have access to it, will essentially need to have to pay a fee or a tax to be using that. Just like now, so many of you are already paying that tax to be using cloud computing. That I don't think is a healthy development. It's not obvious to me that even the economic benefits of it, from the kind of neoliberal, neoclassical case, can be argued very coherently, which makes me think that we do need a strategy of how we can repurpose some of that data, but also some of that artificial intelligence that has been created on top of it, to make sure that all that precious resource does not end up either on the service of Chinese companies in Beijing or on the service of American companies in Silicon Valley, with them then dictating the terms to the rest of society. And from there, we can then start thinking about interventions, which I'm more than happy to do. But without realizing the general background of how these firms promise to liberate us, while at the same time kind of enslaving us, what I call predatory emancipation, it will be very hard to have that discussion about solutions. Because for venture capitalists, there is very little to solve. They're already doing quite well.
If I may react to this directly, so this dialectics of compassion and detachment, which you describe, I think, also, of course, this not only happens in digital space or on the level of data, but also on the level of urban space and of land ownership and of public space. Let me just give you one example. One example I was working with in the context of Bubble Vision was the new Amazon headquarters in Seattle. And they look like a series of bubbles. It's very interesting. They are called the biospheres. They look like geodesic domes, and there is a nice greenhouse inside, maybe supposed to refer to an Amazon jungle or something like that. So it's a very nice natural conservatory in the middle of urban space, which obviously is proprietary. It's only accessible for Amazon employees and so on and so on. Of course, this kind of space, which could maybe be described as compassionate with some stretch, has a backside, namely the Amazon warehouse, where most of the actual, let's say, physical labor is being done, is also being automated, which is a completely different kind of space, not in the city center, but in a more rural or suburban space. It is square. There is, let's say, it is more or less adapted to the necessities of machines, not to humans, and the working conditions are said to be horrendous. So there is these two spaces which sort of complement one another and which make me think that, you know, there is no temporal succession between the compassionate model and the detached one. They coexist at the same time, but in different urban spaces. There is, of course, a third consequence of this happening in relation to the reordering of urban space or public space, which is the fact that Amazon has released a bid for cities to become one site of their new headquarters, which made cities go into some kind of bidding frenzy, trying to literally change their name to Amazon, for example, give up their kind of governance rights over the space they are supposed to administrate, so that basically public space is being turned into corporate space, also via, let's say, voluntarily giving up their kind of democratic governance model.
Can I respond? Yeah, sure. So let me just clear up two things. First, when I characterize that logic as a logic of compassion, of course, I do not refer to it as actually authentic compassion by any means. By that analogy, we can say that Henry Ford, who was paying his workers a decent wage so they could buy his car, was compassionate. Or, to push it even to a more extreme situation, you can say that, you know, the slave owners who feed their slaves, because they know that if they don't, they're going to die and they're going to lose their property, were also compassionate. So I'm not by any means saying that these firms genuinely have this compassionate outlook, but it does mean that there is also something different in this even analogy I've drawn, because in a sense, both Ford and the slave owners actually eager to do something and step in and fund and employ people and give them money and whatever. With the tech industry right now, yes, we do have a lot of advocacy for initiatives like basic income, but I'm yet to see a commitment and a large check coming from any of those billionaires to actually say, fine, we're going to do that, with an exception of a few trials that they're running in Oakland and somewhere else. And that's the difference, that they want the economy to be working on this principle of compassion, but somebody else who actually has to be compassionate. The second point, I think, is also very good that you've brought in cities into this, because ultimately, and in Germany, I feel it every time I come and there is this discussion about the tech sector. I think there is a tendency to pigeonhole all these discussions into some kind of a label called digital capitalism. And then to assume that this digital capitalism somehow runs unrelated to capitalism as such, and that you can analyze the technology sector completely outside of the financial sector and so forth. And I think would just be wrong. Even picking on Japan, right? If you look at Softbank, which is now the largest investor into technology companies worldwide, yes, everybody goes and celebrates that they have raised a vision fund which has $100 billion in it, and that's now driving a lot of growth in the startup space, AI space, and so forth. But has anybody looked at the actual debt of Softbank? Does anybody know what's the debt level of Softbank? It's around $180 billion. Right? So that actually is much greater than the fund that they have raised, and it's traded, I think, at the junk status, actually. Right? And the only reason why SoftBank even managed to raise so much money so cheaply, of course, has to do with the 2 decades of non-growth in Japan and the low interest environment and so forth. And if you really want to understand where does all this money come from and where it flows, you really have to start there. And my fear is that by operating with this very abstract notion of the digital that is completely disconnected from the real world, we often tend to forget that there are other higher-level processes in the global economy that are driving many of the strengths. Just like the logic of competition between these big tech firms is still driving what it is that they do in cloud computing or artificial intelligence. We tend to think of them as digital monopolies, and we tend to believe that they can do whatever they want. And to some extent, for their particular niche, this is true. Google still dominates search, and Amazon dominates online shopping. But they compete heavily on things like cloud computing and artificial intelligence, which means that their space for maneuver, despite all their might, is relatively small. So if one firm suddenly starts offering AI as a service, all of them has to start offering it, right? And that then defines how much space for this fake compassion they actually have in the rest of the business model.
Now, one thing which is very special about this text is that there is a second part to it, as you said, and the second part has to do with interventions. And I've always been very interested in texts which can be a toolbox for practice, a toolbox for action. And you should all try to download the text. You can find it online. It's Evgeny Morozov, Digital Intermediation of Everything. And Evgeny, the points you suggest actually as very specific interventions to reverse or at least slow down some of the trends which you and Hito have discussed in the panel so far include the following possible interventions. Number 1, breaking the intellectual monopoly of big tech. Number 2, finding power in the digital. Number 3, to go beyond the freedom as a service. Number 4, challenging the positivism of the algorithmic consensus. Number 5, towards a different global village. So I want to ask you first to tell us about these solutions you suggest, these interventions, and then maybe ask Hito after that to comment to which extent, this is a toolbox for you as a practitioner and how you address these points.
Sure. So I must also specify at the beginning that text was written for a gathering of artists and civil society organizations. So I wouldn't tell them you have to go and renationalize all of the data that exists in your country, because clearly they were not in a position to do that. So all of those recommendations that you have highlighted, they mostly target the artistic and the intellectual world. This is why so much of it revolves around the need to challenge the intellectual foundations of this data-driven decision-making, how we identify, what counts as fake news and what doesn't. There is a lot of it, I think, which will result in suppression of quite a lot of subversive, but ultimately productive practices. I'm reminded here of an essay by, in this context actually by an artist, by Oswald Wiener from the late 1960s, where he was describing the effect of computers and cybernetics on our thought. And at some point he mentions that, sometimes you actually need all sorts of contradictions to accumulate and break the paradigm, right? So you don't need to resolve them as they happen. You don't need to catch them in some kind of with predictive modeling and adjust to them in real time. You actually need those contradictions, intellectual, political, artistic ones, to accumulate, and this is how a breakthrough might happen. If you had computers in 15th century, Galileo might never have had an insight. He would just be able to rationalize all the data he was accumulating with the models that he had, right? And so sometimes you need, for this paradigm change, some of those accumulations to basically happen. So feedback-driven, data-driven decision-making has this downside, that it very often reinforces the status quo, right? And this is where I think artists, particularly those of the more subversive bent, have traditionally been the target of such kind of thinking, right, which seeks to generate complacency and does not really allow much spaces for dissent. But on the more political side, outside of the many artistic practices we can debate, I think the basic question we have to decide and to solve is, to what extent we would like to get a somewhat different perspective on the digital. To what extent we would like to keep it in the sphere of privacy, for example, in these legalistic debates about surveillance, or to what extent we would like to broaden that a little bit and to also introduce some of the debates about trade, some of the debates about industrial strategy, some of the debates about the economy, because to me it's obvious that the kind of structural transformation that we are living now, with artificial intelligence becoming the key intermediary in many sectors, including production, including manufacturing, but including also healthcare and education, it's the kind of change that you cannot just address from either the artistic paradigm or the legalistic activist paradigm that is all about privacy and anti-surveillance. Those are two very important domains, and we should not lose those kinds of thinking. But we clearly need to be able to understand whether new types of dependencies are being erected also in the world system. Because ultimately, you don't need to be very advanced in your, future analysis and prediction modeling to understand that Europe does not have many of the resources for this new economy to function properly that the Chinese and the Americans have. And we are no longer living in a world where you could always count on the Americans to do the right thing for the Europeans, as the Trump administration keeps reminding us every day. And not having that crucial resource, I think it's a big problem. And then the question should become, should we be doing something else with regards to data regimes, data ownership regimes? Should we be having a more advanced AI strategy that will try to catch up? Should we be maybe going back to the idea of having European and national, maybe even champions in these spheres? Because ultimately, a lot of decisions that have produced this desert of actual AI technology in Europe, they stem from decisions that were taken in the 1970s and 1980s with regards to the liberalization of data flow regimes, with regards to liberalization of the economy as a whole. And here you really have to decide to what extent you would like to have some power in this sense, also nationally, which would mean having control and access over that crucial infrastructure, or they would like to surrender it, right? And this is where we can't just do it with artistic interventions, as important as they are. This is where we have to put that question at the front and center of the national debate, but also the European debate. Because, whenever we hear this new techno-colonialist kind of nightmare, where Europe from the oppressor becomes the victim, sort of, right, and has to more or less depend on just a handful of Chinese or American companies, it's a very dark future. I don't think that there is a way to leverage the situation well, despite the immense growth and the immense size of the European economy.
Of course, as a cultural producer, I'm not able to respond to that in detail, but I think there is actually some aspects of my practice which could be very helpful for that debate. You mentioned fake news in the beginning. As you know, Facebook has released a new strategy for trying to deal with fake news, which is leaving it to its users to identify credible sources. That's very interesting because I was trained as a documentary filmmaker, and the one thing I can tell you is that a credible source is not defined by being popular, right? You cannot define a credible source by way of a plebiscite or referendum. It's simply not how this is being done. And actually this kind of strategy goes back to the beginning of developing the search algorithm for Google. I was very surprised at the beginning to hear that it was based on some kind of popular anecdote which is called the wisdom of the crowds. The wisdom of the crowds is a sort of, let's say, fable developed by Francis Galton, which was a sort, not even a mental experiment, a real experiment on a farmer's market. He was going to figure out how to determine the weight of a cow. And he had several ways of doing it. One was very simple: put the cow on a scale and see how heavy is the cow. But he chose another way. He asked everyone around, and then he created a median of all the answers, and he realized, okay, well, that's great. The answers of the people, which mostly were farmers on the farmers' market, are a very good predictor. Now, that's fair enough, and I really believe that it's possible, using this kind of probabilistic method to determine the weight of a cow. But just imagine if the question is the cow called Milka or is she called Zenzi? Because there's only 3 possible answers to that. It's A, B, or neither A or B. Or maybe she's called both. That's also possible. But this is not a question which can be solved using sort of popularity contests or referendums. This is not a question of popularity. Even if 90% of Facebook users choose, one answer over the others, it's not going to give you any kind of reference as to whether the result is factual or not. So in that sense, I think just not trying to forget all the experiences that were made in questioning documentary truth, sources, all of that over the course of the 20th century, questioning photographic indexicality and so on and so on. Are we going to start all of these debates absolutely from scratch now in the 21st century on the level of algorithmic realism? I don't think that's necessary.
There could not be a better conclusion, and maybe we can quote both of you from the exquisite carbs which you did before we started the panel, because it's actually fascinating, because as some of you know from last year's session, I started an Instagram account some years ago to protest against the disappearance of doodling and handwriting, and to kind of celebrate it and bring it back into digital media. So my Instagram is solely devoted to handwritten notes. I mean, either with digitally written with stylos or with pens and pencils and so on. And when we were actually last year having lunch after the conference at the Google Cultural Institute with Hito and Ben Vickers, Hito thought it would be a bit repetitive to do yet another handwritten note. And then Ben came up with this great idea that we should revisit the all surrealist game of the exquisite carbs, which I encourage you all to play during the DLD, because it's a lot of fun. When you're with two or three friends, you fold a paper into 3 or 4 parts, and then each of you does one part, and at the end you unfold it and see what comes out. Anyway, Evgeny Hito, together with also Jeremy Shaw, the artist who showed his film this morning, did an exquisite carbs, and it reads: power, avoiding the inevitable, is not futile if you're enjoying it. Hito and Evgeny, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here.